They were never meant to be nice. Elves once struck fear, not wonder. Some brought blessings, others brought nightmares. Light and dark, beauty and danger. This is Pantheon mythology, and this is the duality of elves. If you too want to be beautiful and dangerous, then check out Pantheon Apparel, our clothing brand inspired by legends and lore from around the world. We ship worldwide and are rated excellent on Trustpilot. Link in the description.
Long before elves wore flowing robes or wielded bows in fantasy epics, they were something stranger. Rooted in myth, folklore, and fear. The word elf once referenced a broad category of supernatural beings across northern Europe. Sometimes they blessed crops or healed the sick. Other times they were blamed for nightmares, madness, and wasting illness. They were not small, not friendly, and certainly not safe. But it's in Norse mythology where we first see them truly divided, light versus dark. The earliest written mention of elves being split into different kinds comes from Norse mythology. In the Prose Edda written by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, elves appear as two distinct types, the Ljósalvar, or light elves, and the Dorkelvar, the dark elves. The light elves were said to dwell in Alfheim, a heavenly realm gifted to the god Freyr. They were described as fairer than the sun, radiant, graceful, and closely tied to fertility, beauty, and good fortune. Some scholars even suggest they had a connection to ancestor worship, hinting at a deeper spiritual significance. The dark elves, meanwhile, were a different story. They were said to live underground and were described as blacker than pitch. Beyond that, they get a bit murky. Some believe Snorri may have been referring to dwarves, known for their craftsmanship and their subterranean homes, but others believe these beings were something more sinister. Their hidden nature, their darkness, their distance from the gods, all of it paints a much more ominous picture. And this wasn't just a cosmetic split between light and dark, it speaks to something older and more symbolic, an echo of Norse cosmology itself, a world built on contrasts, Asgard and Helheim, fire and ice, gods and giants. Elves fit right into that structure, beings who could either bless your life or haunt your dreams, depending on which side they came from. The idea of elves being divided, one half dazzling, the other dangerous, would leave a lasting mark on how they were seen for centuries to come. But the Norse division is just one part of the story. To really understand how elves were seen in the past, we need to go deeper, quite literally. In early Germanic and Scandinavian belief, elves weren't just creatures of forest or sky, they were closely tied to the dead. Across these cultures, burial mounds, known as haugur in Old Norse, were believed to house not just the remains of ancestors, but active, watching spirits, people who feared what might stir beneath the earth, and many believed elves lived in or beneath these mounds, sharing space with the dead or being part of them entirely. It was common to leave offerings at these sites, bread, milk, ale, tokens of respect or appeasement. Some would whisper wishes or prayers. The line between worship and warding off was always thin. Elves could be benevolent, but if neglected or disrespected, they could become dangerous. Their fear wasn't abstract, it was part of everyday life. There's a theory that elves were once ancestral spirits themselves, elevated after death, lingering as powerful presences tied to families' fertility and fate. They could bring blessings, healthy children, and good harvests. But they were also blamed for sudden illnesses, deformity, madness, and wasting disease, conditions without clear cause. The Old English term, elfsiden, literally means elf-struck, a condition linked to seizures or mysterious pain. In some sources, they were even connected to childbirth and the protection, or theft, of infants. And this is important, because before elves were beautiful, they were feared. They weren't comic relief or noble warriors. They were unseen forces that haunted the edges of human life, elusive, unpredictable, and hard to name without inviting trouble. The kind of presence people tried to live with, not provoke, respected in life, feared in death, and never entirely gone. Belief in elves wasn't just limited to the Norse world. Similar beings appeared across Europe, often blending with local spirits, gods, and ancestral forces. But it's the Celtic traditions, particularly from Ireland and Scotland, that had a huge impact on how we imagine elves today. In Irish mythology, the Sidhe, also known as the Aeschi, were powerful, otherworldly beings who lived beneath the earth in burial mounds or hidden hills. They weren't called elves, but they shared many traits: beauty, danger, and the tendency to meddle in human affairs. Some stories describe them as fallen gods, the Tuatha De Danann, who retreated into the other world after being defeated by mortal humans. They became invisible, elusive, and unpredictable. Offerings were still made to them, and it was considered unwise to speak ill of them or even say their name directly. In Scotland, similar ideas appear in tales of the fair folk, or good neighbours, polite names for beings who could curse your cattle, steal your children, or lead you astray in the mist if you weren't careful. They were stunningly beautiful, but they didn't think like humans. Their rules were their own, and breaking them could be dangerous. These Celtic beings, with their elegance, mystery, and hidden realms, had a major influence on the way elves would be portrayed in literature centuries later. They helped shift the image away from the frightening spirits or ancestral ghosts and towards something more alluring, still dangerous, but captivating. And this wasn't just happening on the British Isles. In Slavic traditions, beings like the domovoi and rusalka also show some overlap. The domovoi was a household spirit, protective if treated well, vengeful if angered. The rusalka, often linked to water or the souls of the dead, could be both beautiful and deadly. Similar stories crop up in Baltic folklore too, with forest beings and ancestral spirits blurring the line between elf, ghost, and god. Across Europe, the idea of elves kept shifting, adapting to local beliefs, changing faces, but always keeping the same tension between charm and threat. In Iceland, the belief in elves never fully faded. Instead, it transformed into something uniquely local, the Huldufolk, or hidden people. These beings are said to live in rocks, hillsides, and remote landscapes, invisible to most, but still very present in the Icelandic imagination. The Huldufolk share many traits with elves and fae from elsewhere in Europe. They are beautiful, secretive, and easily offended. They prefer to be left alone, and disturbing their homes is considered a serious risk. In fact, even today, construction projects in Iceland are sometimes altered to avoid areas believed to be sacred to the hidden people. Roads have been rerouted, building plans paused, and surveys conducted not out of superstition, but out of respect for tradition, for nature, and maybe, just in case, for them. Iceland is one of the few places where belief in these beings has quietly survived into modern times. It's not always literal, but it's embedded in the culture, taught in schools, shared in stories, and treated with quiet seriousness. For many, respecting the Huldufolk is about more than spirits. It's about honouring the land, the past, and the unseen forces that still shape both. Iceland's raw volcanic terrain only strengthens their presence. Mist-covered lava fields, strange rock formations, and remote valleys all feel like places where something other lives. In a land shaped by fire and ice, the idea of invisible neighbours doesn't seem too far-fetched. Their elusiveness is part of what makes them so powerful. Like the Sidhe in Ireland, or the elves of Old Norse belief, they exist just out of reach. Always watching, always listening. You won't find them unless they want you to. And if they do appear, it's rarely without consequence. The Huldufolk are a reminder that even in the modern world, the old ways still linger, and that sometimes the most powerful beings are the ones you never see. In many traditions, elves were seen as guardians of the natural world. Certain groves, springs, or stones were considered sacred not because of their physical beauty, but because something lived there, something watching. To harm those places was to risk angering the beings tied to them. Cutting down a tree without asking, polluting a stream, or building on the wrong patch of land could bring illness, misfortune, or a curse. In Germanic folklore, for instance, some groves were believed to belong to the elves. Farmers might leave offerings near a particular tree or spring to ensure good weather or a healthy harvest. It wasn't formal worship, it was insurance. You weren't just clearing land, you were taking a risk with whatever unseen force might be living there. People didn't always picture elves as humanoid figures lurking in the trees. Sometimes it was just a feeling. The hairs on your neck rising in a quiet forest, the shift in the air by a still lake, or a sudden silence in the wind. Elves were presence, not appearance. In this way, they weren't just a part of nature, they were nature, personified. The lushness of a forest, the sudden fog on a hill, the eerie calm of a glade. These were signs that something unseen was near. And that belief system, at its core, shares a lot with animism, the idea that all things, living or not, carry a spirit. A rock, a river, a tree, or a wind could all be alive in some sense, and elves were a way of understanding that presence. Even today, these ideas echo in modern environmental concerns. The belief that nature should be respected, that wild spaces aren't just resources but something sacred, finds ancient roots in these stories. Elves were a warning as much as a wonder. Respect the land, or face the consequences. Modern fantasy often treats elves as inhabitants of nature, archers in treehouses or mountain citadels. But in older traditions, they were the spirit of the place itself. At some point, the fear started to fade. The unsettling, powerful elves of old folklore began to change, especially during the Victorian era. As interest in folklore grew, so did a desire to make it more palatable. The darker edges were smoothed over, and elves, along with fairies and other spirits, were softened into something charming. The Victorians lived in an age that loved the mystical but demanded moral order. Dangerous folklore was reshaped into something appropriate, often romanticized or infantilized, to fit the sensibilities of the time. What couldn't be erased was reimagined for children or painted in soft, sentimental tones. Elves became gentler, more refined, and more human in appearance. They were reimagined as elegant woodland dwellers, often small and graceful, but not grotesque or terrifying. While fairies were given wings and sparkles, elves were often portrayed as youthful, playful, and aesthetically pleasing. They no longer caused illness or haunted the edges of society. They danced at moonlit parties, lived in hidden glades, and offered just enough mystery to charm rather than frighten. It was during this period that the modern idea of the beautiful, harmless elf began to take root. Shakespeare had already nudged this transformation with characters like Puck and Titania in A Midsummer Night's Dream. But the Victorians took it further. Artists like Richard Dadd and poets like Christina Rossetti filled their work with luminous, childlike beings who bore little resemblance to the eerie spirits of older belief. This sanitized version of elven lore pushed aside their older identities. The connection to nature, death, and the unseen world was replaced with glitter and mischief. They were still magical, but no longer threatening. By making them pretty, they became predictable, and in doing so, we lost much of what made them powerful. If the Victorians made elves pretty, it was Tolkien who made them noble. In The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, J.R.R. Tolkien reimagined elves as ancient, near-immortal beings filled with beauty, wisdom, and sorrow. They were tall, graceful, and deeply connected to both nature and magic. But what set them apart was their sense of melancholy. Tolkien's elves live with the weight of memory, carrying the pain of ages past. They are long-lived and resistant to time, but not untouchable. They can be slain, and they can suffer. They weren't flawless. Some of Tolkien's elves are proud, even arrogant. They wage wars, defy the guidance of the Valar, the powerful beings who shape the world, and suffer the consequences. That moral depth is part of what made them so compelling. They weren't just distant paragons, they were tragic too. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. Tolkien, a scholar of ancient languages and mythologies, drew heavily from Norse, Celtic, and Christian traditions, blending them into something entirely new. His elves were inspired by the Ljósalfa of Norse mythology, the elegance of the Sidhe, and the sorrow of fallen angels. But more than anything, he gave them a soul, depth, culture, and a history that stretched back thousands of years. Even the way we picture elves today, tall, ethereal, with angular features and pointed ears, owes more to Tolkien than to any older myth. His vision was set in the visual blueprint that modern fantasy artists, game designers, and filmmakers still follow. It marked a total shift. Elves were no longer feared spirits lurking in burial mounds or behind trees. They became heroes, rulers, and scholars. Their mystery didn't vanish, but it became noble instead of dangerous. Tolkien didn't just popularize a new kind of elf, he replaced the old one. His visions became the global default. The way elves have looked over the centuries tells its own story. In the earliest traditions, elves weren't necessarily beautiful. They were strange, otherworldly, and sometimes grotesque. In Norse and early Germanic beliefs, their appearance was rarely described at all, which only made them more unsettling. They were felt, not seen, linked to illness, misfortune, or strange lights in the distance. When they did appear in medieval texts or early folklore, they could look ghostly, aged, or uncanny. But over time, especially with the influence of Celtic fairy lore and Victorian romanticism, that began to shift. Elves started to take on more human features, refined, youthful, and elegant. By the 19th century, they were often shown as slender, ethereal beings with delicate features and flowing hair. Their clothing became more ornate, their settings more pastoral. They no longer haunted burial mounds or brought disease. They danced in moonlit forests and wore silken robes. Tolkien's influence made this look the standard. His elves became the model for countless artists, filmmakers, and game designers who leaned into the elegance, melancholy, and grandeur he popularized. Modern media followed suit. Elves in fantasy games and series were often designed to be striking, almost impossibly beautiful. They are usually androgynous, with sharp cheekbones, luminous skin, and eyes that hint at ancient knowledge. Their pointed ears are now standard, the eerie ambiguity is gone, replaced with polish and perfection. From unseen spirits to fashion icons of the fantasy world, the evolution of elven aesthetics has mirrored our changing relationship with mystery. The more familiar they became, the more beautiful we made them. Elves have always reflected on more than just fantasy. In many ways they mirror us, our anxieties, our ideals, and our fears about the world around us. In modern stories, elves are often tied to nature, long life, and the fading of magic. That theme of decline, of a once great people slowly vanishing, echoes real-world concerns. Climate change, cultural loss, even post-colonial guilt. Elves represent something ancient and beautiful slipping away, and our helplessness to stop it. But they also show us the danger of idealization. The perfect, beautiful elf often comes with coldness, arrogance, and detachment. Their beauty becomes a mask, their immortality a barrier. They live too long, care too little, and see humans as fragile, fleeting, and foolish. Immortality stretches their sense of time. A human lifetime might pass like a season. Grief dulls, love fades, and urgency becomes a foreign concept. It's not that they lack emotion, it's that their scale of experience makes ours feel small. Even their morality feels distant. The so-called good elves in modern fiction aren't always kind. They can be elitist, cruel, or bound by ancient laws that don't make sense to human characters. They exist on a different timeline, and their actions aren't always about right and wrong, but about preservation, memory, or power. In the end, elves aren't just a fantasy race. They're a reflection of everything we admire and everything we mistrust. Beauty without warmth, power without accountability, wisdom that has forgotten how to care.
So what are elves, really? They've been spirits of the dead, guardians of nature, tricksters, healers, and nightmares. They've worn the faces of ancestors, gods, and fading nobility. Sometimes they bless, sometimes they curse. Sometimes they vanish into the mist. Other times they live forever. We made them beautiful, then feared their beauty. We made them perfect, then mistrusted their perfection. Every version of the elf, from the eerie to the elegant, says more about us than it does about them. They were never meant to be nice. Maybe that's why they've lasted.